China-United States relations. 40 years after the establishment of diplomatic ties between the two countries, where do things stand now? And what's next? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. "40 years ago this month, China and the United States established diplomatic ties. Just weeks later, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping visited President Jimmy Carter at the White House. The visit took place as China launched major reform and opening up policies that would transform the nation. Recently, we established a distinguished panel of guests to discuss all that during a special town hall program recorded at the George Washington University. Joining us were Zhou Jingxing, Minister Counselor and Director of the Political Section at the Chinese Embassy in the United States. With us too was Martin Jacques. He is a Senior Fellow of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, and he's the author of When China Rules the World. Robert Hormats, a former U.S. Undersecretary of State and Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates, also joined us, and so did Yukon Huang, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Asia Program. He's also the author of Cracking the China Conundrum. As we talked about China's transformative reform and opening up policies, the discussion also turned to the U.S.-China relationship. We explored a range of issues, everything from trade to current and future challenges. And for this show, we put together some of those moments. First, I wanted to know more about the impact of those early Sino-U.S. ties. Let's watch. When China was opening up, it also opened up globally. Shortly after opening up, it established diplomatic relations with the United States in 1979. Deng Xiaoping came here to the United States. In fact, he came here to an office a few blocks from where we are sitting right now, at the White House. How important were those early Sino-U.S. ties to China's opening up?
Extremely important. I remember the Minister Counselor made this point. I just want to reemphasize it. I went to China originally. I was working as Kissinger's economic advisor in the early 70s. And no one could have ever imagined what China was going to look like 20 years beyond, and certainly today no one would have dreamt. And it's hard for Americans to understand, we had no economic relationship with China in the early 70s. There was no trade, there was no investment, there was no financial interaction. China was not part of the IMF, the World Bank, or the GATT at that point. China was really an economy which was following a very national, sort of local model. It did not integrate with the rest of the world. And the events of the late 1970s, early 1980s really were remarkable. One, because Deng Xiaoping understood that China couldn't continue the way it was. Things were going very badly economically. It was poor, and it had no strategy at all. He didn't have a particularly bold strategy that was long-term oriented, but he knew he couldn't continue the model of that period of time. And therefore, he experimented. I think that was one of the, when Roosevelt came in during the Depression, he said, what this country wants and needs is bold, persistent experimentation. I think Deng had the same view. And he was willing to have special economic zones. He was willing to give provinces more opportunity to do their thing and not necessarily follow a national model. He was willing to open up and visit other countries, as the film we just saw indicated. He came to the United States. And I can remember having conversations with him during that period. And one of the things he was most proud of is the fact that he enabled Chinese students to study abroad. He enabled foreign advisors to come to China. Not that he was going to buy everything the West did or said, but that he could use these experiences. And at one conversation that was particularly meaningful for me, I was commenting on the changes that were about to take place or were taking place. This is late 1970s, early 80s. He said, just wait. He said, we have 10,000 Chinese students studying abroad. When they come home, they're going to change China. And he didn't mean that they were going to be able to take over right away, but the ideas that China could take from other countries, not from the Soviet Union, which he regarded as a failed economic experiment from the beginning, but learning from other countries, the United States, Japan, Korea, numerous other countries. He understood that the transformation of China would depend largely, of course, on the people of China. He understood that. But the people of China needed opportunity to experiment, to learn new things, new ways of doing things. And one way was to interact with the rest of the world. So we definitely saw China as changing internally, but also interacting with the rest of the world in a way that China had not done during the Cultural Revolution or before.
You know, before this current trade dispute that we see now between China and the United States, the two countries had built up a substantial economic relationship. Some even called it, quote, the most important economic partnership in the world. Now, recently we talked with the former United States ambassador to China, Gary Locke, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch.
When Nixon first went to China, our yearly two-way trade was less than $100 million. Very few jobs on both sides of the Pacific depended on this two-way trade. But today, every single day, over $1.5 billion of trade flows between our two countries, and millions of jobs depend on exports to each other's countries, as well as the indirect jobs that benefit or that are supported by all the people who are engaged in this trade. China has invested a lot in the United States, and those Chinese companies that are manufacturing here, doing work here, employ hundreds of thousands of people, and the same is true of American companies in China.
So, Robert, 40 years of engagement has resulted in changes in trade volumes, in jobs, in investments. How would you assess the economic partnership now?
Well, I think there are two elements of this. One goes back to a point Martin raised earlier, and that is the U.S. initially, when China joined the WTO, had this notion, almost a fantasy, that the Chinese economy and the American economy would converge. That China's economy, as a result of being part of the global economy, would become like the West. It would adopt all the institutions and the economic practices of the West. That didn't happen. China took some very positive things from the Western practice and integrated them into the Chinese system. But it was never anyone's intention, Deng's or anyone else's, to make the Chinese economy just like ours, although they learned and they took a number of things that we were able to provide and help to begin to interject them into the Chinese system. I think that the surprise for the West has been how quickly China has become so competitive in so many advanced technologies. And so to answer the second part of your question, it won't be the same as the first 30 years. It'll be very different. It was comfortable for the United States to assume it was going to be the technology leader and China would be the leader in labor-intensive products. And that was fairly comfortable, and Americans could sort of understand this. What has been so, I think, interesting to Americans and jarring is how quickly China has become so competitive. And what's important about it is that China now and the United States are vying for who is going to be the leader, or at least the most competitive country in advanced technologies, AI, quantum computing, biotechnology, autonomous vehicles, all these things. No one expected the U.S. would have a competitor like this, much less a country that was really underdeveloped 30 years ago. And now China can compete in all these areas. This, for Americans, is sort of shocking. So that it won't see China the same way as it did 20 or 30 years ago. The other part of this is that almost all these technologies have a security component to them, whether they do today or they will tomorrow. So that adds another source of potential contention, or at least difference of view between the United States and China, that not only is China competitive in these new technologies, but that they can be useful in a security relationship or in strengthening. America looks at new technologies as strengthening its security. China looks at new technologies as strengthening its security. The key question now is, how do we manage this relationship in a different environment where we're competing in high technology spheres as opposed to the way we were competing labor intensive versus capital intensive 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So managing these differences is going to require a very different set of concepts, a very different set of relationships, and an understanding that we're competitive in certain new technologies. China's going to continue to advance. We're hopefully going to continue to advance, but working out how the global economy develops rules and practices and norms to avoid conflicts in these technologies and to ensure a level playing field in these technologies, that's going to be a very, very big challenge, quite different from the challenge of the last 20 years.
Zhou Jingxing, let me get your thoughts on that. How do these two countries manage those differences?
Well, as I see it, I think over the past 40 years, because January 1st, 1979, that was the day China and the United States established diplomatic relations. Right. So this 40 years of reform and opening up coincided with the 40th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between China and the United States. So over the past 4 decades, China and the United States have been cooperation partners. And of course, there was some kind of competition between the two sides, but cooperation has always been the main stream between China and the United States over the past 4 decades. And I think this is going to remain so in the next possibly 30 or 40 years. And that is because I think that for the first time ever in human history, we are going to have a globalized economy. And the international division of labor is going to be readjusted to the extent that China is moving up toward the top or to the top of the industrial chain, while the United States continues or remains on the top. And the other countries are also moving up, catching up. There is a kind of competition in that sense, in terms of economic development, running our own countries, and also improving the governance of our respective economies. So that kind of competition actually is healthy. It helps both China, the United States, and other countries to do a better job in running their own country. Yep. And that is good for mankind, and that's how human society will progress in the future. So I think that if Chinese Americans take a look from that perspective at their bilateral relationship in the next 3 or 4 decades, or even longer than that, then I think that this bilateral relationship will be really cooperative and productive. And it is going to be a very good thing for mankind.
Can I just say one thing about the last question first?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm much more pessimistic. You see, basically, the 40 years depended on, obviously, this relationship depended on the fact that the United States was much, much stronger than China. And as China developed, then the relationship steadily grew more equal, to the point where, as others like Robert have explained, America was now being seriously challenged on a variety of fronts by China. And it's very difficult for a country which has been the hegemon ever since the Second World War to adapt to a situation where it can no longer insist and rely on its own primacy in the world. This is never an easy process. I mean, I come from Britain. You know, Britain's struggled with this, even now it's a much more limited country. But it's always been in denial of its decline, even when it's obvious that it's declining. It's been in denial of it. And I think that America is going to find this process extraordinarily difficult, not least because it's a country which historically, in an extraordinary way, has almost always been on the rise. Right. You know, I mean, most countries have been up and down. China's been up and down. America's always been on the rise. What does that mean? I think the fact, when you're up and down, you learn a certain resilience. I don't think America does necessarily have that resilience. So I would paint the future in a much more difficult and elusive fashion. I think the next few decades, probably the absolutely critical story, narrative, discourse is going to be how America copes with this situation. And what can only be described as a profound existential crisis. Now, how in that situation China and the United States relate to each other is going to be a very complicated question. One thing is absolutely clear. That period since 1972 is over. That's an era that's finished. There's no point in thinking we can reconstruct it. It cannot be reconstructed because the reasons for it are very profound, historically very profound indeed. And so we have to think of the future in a different kind of way. And that's going to be a great challenge to China on the one hand and the United States on the other, which, however much they interacted and so on, there's still a lack of understanding, actually, between them. I mean, you know, the Chinese leadership did not see this coming. That's interesting, because the Chinese, you know, have invested so much effort in trying to understand what's happening in the United States. But when it comes to it, it's very difficult to understand what happens in a different society, just as the Americans find it almost impossible to understand China.
One of the questions that I've heard from Chinese people is, what exactly does America want of the Chinese?
An insight into the lack of comprehension of what a country like America thinks about suddenly being placed in the situation which Robert outlined, about a situation where it's under challenge from China, which it never anticipated. I mean, the basic assumptions that were made by America during this period were, one, that China at some point wouldn't be able to make it economically, it would go wrong, it would not ground to a halt, or it might do. I mean, think of all the bears that have dominated the debate in the West about China's economic prospects. The bears have always had it against the bulls. And the second thing is they always assumed that China, essentially the assumption was modernization is westernization.
Right.
China's modernization would lead to a Western-style society. And America got it chronically, desperately wrong on both those assumptions.
Okay, I want to get to another question from our international audience. This one is from Professor Alan Burrell. He specializes in international trade with China. We recorded this question earlier on. Let's watch.
In recent years, we've seen rising tension between the USA and China. Does the panel believe that this might lead to Europe becoming China's biggest trading partner and replacing the USA?
Yukon Huang, will the European Union take the place of the United States? I mean, we have seen a stream of European leaders going to Beijing. Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, has been there as well.
Well, this actually relates to what Martin is saying. When you talk about the future, we're talking about right now, you have an extraordinary coincidence. America, Europe, China, if you value their economy in purchasing power parity terms, they're exactly equal. So you have a suddenly rising China, but declining Europe, United States. Just right now, they're intersecting. If you look at their shares of trade, exports, imports, it's a share of the global trade. Europe, America, China shares exactly the same. So no wonder we feel this kind of a tension. The tension of being is the power shifting in some ways. Europe is prepared itself much better than America in one way. Europe is generating significant trade surpluses now because it's brought its budget into balance, et cetera, et cetera. America's trade balance is going to go the other way. It's going to get much larger and much worse. So on one score, Europe's trading relationship with China will be less tense in the future than America's. And because of the composition of trade, what they want, there's also what I call an interesting kind of complementarity which does not exist with China and America. America's trade with China is basically agricultural commodities, planes, and high-value services. Europe's trade with China is across a broad spectrum of manufactured goods, from cars to transport equipment to manufactured goods and high-end consumption goods. So you go to China and you walk into the malls and you look at the stores, that 90% European, okay? You don't see any American stores there. You only see European stores. So this issue about synergism between Europe and China in terms of trade relationships is actually, I think, something which is emerging. And that's why you see at a certain level, stronger interaction between Europe and China in trying to forge relationships on WTO, bilateral investment treaties, partially in response to what they see happening here in the United States in terms of White House trade policies. So I think that is, in fact, a trend that's emerging.
Okay, we are going to take a question now from a member of our audience. Song Zhang is there. He's from Shanghai Wenhui Daily. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think at least to a lot of policy-making people in Washington here, the so-called decoupling policy is a way to contain China, which means America will try to drive away their supply chain out of China and to neighboring countries. To what extent do you think the policy will work, and what China should take actions to deal with it? Thank you.
Robert?
Yeah, this is a very good question, which goes back to the question we were discussing a little while ago. I think there are two schools of thought in the current administration, and perhaps in the country as well, but sort of focus on the current administration. One is that the goal of the United States should be to contain China's rise as an advanced technology power, to contain China's advance in the 21st century technologies, because they're so critical to economic growth, that if China does succeed in becoming preeminent or much stronger, it will give China an even greater economic advantage than the U.S. I think some people exaggerate this, but they make the case anyway. And then there are those who say, well, China is going to advance as a technology power, but what we ought to be doing is negotiating the rules of competition today. Subsidy issues, questions of partnership requirements, things of that sort that are on the American trade negotiating agenda. So one is hold China down, and that would go into the school of thought that you're suggesting, and that is to try to decouple so that American companies won't be as dependent on Chinese products, particularly advanced technology products, and the United States won't sell high technology products to China, or allow its companies to invest in China if that suggests transfer of technology. There's one school of thought that strongly holds to that view, and some of those people are in the White House. And then there's another that puts it in a more conventional negotiating rules-based, rules-oriented conversation. Can the two be severed? Can our economies be decoupled? I think that would be very difficult, and I think also a problem, because competition in the global economy, as we were discussing earlier, depends on interaction. The great papers in advanced technologies, in advanced bioscience, are done between scientists in China, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere working together. Some of the advanced technologies in a lot of areas are collaborational. So to sever that, the relationship between the United States and the rapidly rising Chinese economy, I think, A, would be very difficult, and B, I think would probably set back technological advancement in at least some sectors.
Okay, I want to go to another question now from our audience, and this is Ambassador Cecilia Nahan. Ambassador, nice to have you here. Go ahead with your question.
Hello, how are you? Recently, the Trump administration has referred to China's activity in Latin America as predatory. So my question is, what do you think about this? And more broadly, how would you characterize the role, the goals, and the challenges of Chinese engagement in Latin America? Thank you.
Right, this is a characterization we've heard about. Zhou Jingxing, what is your response to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think it actually concerns about China's worldview, what kind of world China wants. And just now you said that many Chinese are asking another question, what the United States wants from China. And I think a more fundamental question is, what kind of world does the United States want? So because these two questions actually concern about the very fundamentals of our worldviews. And I think we see the world as one in which that all countries can coexist with each other peacefully. And regardless of their size, strength, and also wealth, we should work together to entertain and make decisions on international and regional issues together. And I think that's how we see the world. And that is why at the 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping put forward the idea of building a community of shared a future for mankind. So our foreign policy toward Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the other region of the world actually have something in common. That is, we want to have a mutually beneficial relationship with these countries. We want to work together with them to build a better future for our future generations. And we are not in for competition with the United States or with the other countries to fill into the vacuum left over by a certain power. That's certainly not what we want, because that is inconsistent with our worldview, and that is also actually inconsistent with the Chinese nation's DNA.
Robert, this one for you. China's become more and more engaged with international organizations. It's a member of G20, it's a member of APEC, it's a leading member of BRICS. As China gets more and more involved in world affairs, do you see some pushback from the United States?
It's a really interesting question. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have had an answer very different from today. The problem today is that the United States is pulling back from not only global leadership of these institutions, but a sense of global responsibility for the international economic order. And you can see this in our alliances, in NATO, in our alliances in the Pacific, in the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, etc. And China now is taking a stronger leadership role in many of those institutions. So I think the United States now seems almost disinterested, or at least not interested in being a leader, and China now wants to play a greater role because it wants to be able to shape the future of the global economy, and it knows it can do it as a participant and a leader in some of these institutions. I would just make one point, though, that I think is very critical, and it follows up the question of the possibility of a financial, an energy crisis, an environmental crisis. There's also the danger that the WTO, which has provided the rules and the framework for trade over the last several decades, and the GATT before that, is also in danger of deteriorating and actually collapsing. And I think that the United States and China have had serious difficulties within the context of the WTO. Each brings cases against the other. The rules that we foresee for the WTO are different from those that China advocates, and understandably, because our systems are different. But I think we have to come together and make that institution work, because we're the two biggest trading countries in the world. If that system deteriorates, if the WTO deteriorates, we've seen what happened in the 1920s with no order in the global trading system. Our two countries are going to have to figure out a way of converging, A, to make the WTO work, and B, to provide some common rules and understandings that enable it to function more effectively than it is today. Otherwise, if it deteriorates, we both will be badly damaged, as the global system will be.
And there we must leave it. It was a great discussion. If you would like to see the full town hall program, 40 years and beyond, China Reform and Opening Up, please visit our website at america.cgtn.com. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for joining us.